If you're building software that doesn't scale, begin again. That's not the way. You can build all kinds of fabulous things that don't scale. You can draw things on paper. You can do data analysis. You can make presentations. You can have graphic design. But if you are building software that doesn't scale, you're in a pretty bad place. And look, we all end up there. Heaven knows we've ended up there many times, but it's a place you want to try to exit as quickly as possible because, as you said, it just neutralizes the only good thing about software. If you're building software that doesn't scale, you're just like a tech bro with none of the upside, you know?
This episode of the Startup Podcast is brought to you by Vanta. You might know that sinking feeling. You're about to land a big contract when they ask about compliance. SOC 2, ISO, PCI, Essential 8. You've just snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. Not anymore. Vanta massively accelerates your compliance efforts and allows you to get those life-changing deals back on track. Don't wait until it's panic stations, though. Get started with Vanta today. They're offering 20% off their prices just for TSP listeners. Do yourself a favor, hit pause, go to vanta.com/TSP, that's VANTA.com, to get that 20% off.
You're listening to the Startup Podcast. This is an educational episode. In-depth masterclasses about the concepts essential to building, running, and investing in Silicon Valley-style startups. Whether you're a founder, investor, or operator in a startup, you'll gain insights into the principles that power high-growth disruption, the same way Facebook, Google, and Uber do it. The conversation starts now.
Hi, I'm Yaniv Bernstein.
Hi, I'm Clementine Jacoby.
And in today's episode, we're talking about how to work with customers who are much bigger than you are, the enterprise customer. If you're a regular listener to this show, you know that we talk a lot about the trap of becoming a tech-backed services company, doing lots of one-off work and losing control of your app. So, how do you avoid this trap and have a fruitful relationship with your enterprise customers? To discuss this with us, we have my old friend Clementine Jacoby, founder and CEO of Recidiviz. Recidiviz is a nonprofit company building an open source platform to turn fragmented criminal justice data into actionable insights for practitioners, policymakers, researchers, and the public. This isn't your usual nonprofit, though. Recidiviz is a high growth tech company through and through, having raised tens of millions of dollars in philanthropic capital from Silicon Valley royalty, including Vinod Khosla, Paul Graham and Y Combinator, and the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. Previously, Clementine was a product manager at Google, where I worked with her on Maps and on Android. She was recently named in the Forbes 30 Under 30, Fast Company's Most Creative People, and Time's Next 100 Most Influential People. So, as a company that partners with US states, customers don't get much more enterprisey than those of Recidiviz, which makes Clementine the perfect guest to talk us through building a high-growth, disruptive business off the back of enterprise customers. Clementine, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Yaniv.
So I think Recidiviz obviously is a bit of an unusual business. So before we go into how you deal with your enterprise customers, it would be great just to get a high-level overview of what it is you do and even more, how it is that you do it.
Recidiviz is a tech nonprofit, and we focus on trying to reduce the size of the US criminal justice system in ways that are safe and in ways that scale with technology. So the context here is that the US incarcerates more people and for longer than any place in the history of the world. Nobody really likes this. But in order to get people out of the criminal justice system, you need to actually implement a bunch of really, really complex laws. So, for example, there might be 10 different things that you need to do that you're required to do in order to get off of parole in the United States. But each of those 10 different things may live in 5 different databases, and none of the databases talk to each other. And so Recidiviz's work is that we go through and we build tools that connect all of those underlying fragmented data systems and surface people who are in the criminal justice system who don't need to be there. And then after surfacing those people, we automate a bunch of steps in the process that bring them toward freedom. And this is good for everyone. It saves states lots of money. It brings people to liberty who already should have been free, but it also allows states to improve outcomes in the criminal justice system because now that they have fewer people to take care of, they can do a better job.
So just so I understand correctly, there are people who are eligible for parole, but nobody knows it because the data is so fragmented. So you mentioned that you work exclusively with US state governments, the 50 of them. So that's a very concentrated market. And on this podcast, we often talk about how to work with large enterprise customers, the bureaucracies inside, and the challenges of those. I imagine that's just dialed up to 11 with the famously diverse US government system.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, like, for example, for a state to purchase something from a vendor, any vendor, they'll usually have to go through a process called a request for proposals. And that may have like a laundry list of 1,000 different requirements, each of them more crazy than the last. And it can be really frustrating and really sad in some ways because they become these kind of design by committee documents that outline every feature that everyone could possibly want. And it often means that government, which we want to get like the best possible software, gets the worst possible software because of literally the way that purchasing works. So there's all kinds of ways in which the like enterprise constraints are just, as you said, dialed up to 11 with the government.
One of the things that we've talked about and you and I discussed prior to getting started, Clementine, is the one-off problem, or what we often call here on the podcast, the technology-backed services company problem, which is when you are small and the organization you're dealing with is big, whether it's a big company or a government, there's a tendency for to get bogged down in bureaucracy, which you talked about, and we may come back to that, but B, for there to be a lot of custom work. And the risk that we talk about on this podcast is that all of that custom work means if you say yes to it all, you're not really building a scalable piece of software where you get that massive leverage. Instead, you effectively become an agency or a dev shop. So I'd love to hear a bit more about your experience with that and why it tends to be such a problem in this type of space.
Yeah, it's super tough because I think the temptation to build something custom often comes from the fact that the customer you're talking to is powerful, right? So in our case, every single one of our customers is powerful. There are only 50 of them, and they are all states. And in order to solve the problem we want to solve, we need to get all of them. And they're all really interconnected. So they're all talking to each other all the time. And I imagine some version of each of those dynamics exists for a lot of folks who are building enterprise startups, right? Like your customer base is deeply interconnected to each other, and they're all bigger than you are, and they're all more important than you are. The other thing is that if you have a concentrated market like this with not a huge number of customers, they're right on some level for wanting to request things that are custom, right? Like they are special. There are a few of them and they're big, and they sometimes make what seem like really reasonable demands to get things that are custom. But like you said, you can very easily get pulled into a tide away from being a tech company. And so I think it's like, to even talk about this, it's worth just laying out like why doing a lot of custom work is bad for a tech company in the first place. And I think about this on a little bit of a spectrum, right? There are tech companies, and then on the other hand, you've got like boutique consulting. And the great strength of boutique consulting is that everything is custom, and you can go in and you can design something great for an individual customer. The problem with that when you're building software is that software is really, really, really expensive to build. It's really expensive to build, it's expensive to maintain, it's expensive to keep secure. And the only benefit of software is that it scales. And so if you get into this middle place where you're like building expensive software with expensive back-end engineers and expensive front-end engineers and really amazing data scientists, and then you are customizing each of your products, you end up in a weird spot where your pricing model is somewhere in an unhappy valley between the two. Your sales model is somewhere caught in between the two. And in particular, your team structure is going to be caught in between the two, right? Because when you're a consultancy, usually the way your team is structured is you have a lot of people who are forward deployed and maybe a very thin platform on the back end, right? So you've got people who go in and they deeply understand a customer's need, and maybe there's a few kind of shared analytics functions or whatever that you deploy across customers. And tech companies are the opposite. You've got a thick platform, an expensive platform, and hopefully very little that needs to be forward deployed. And so all of the tensions that we see get created in our space are that pull that starts to make your team look like it's got a lot of both. And now you're building software with a very, very heavy forward deployed team, and everything is expensive and slow moving. We see a lot of this temptation.
It's really interesting. You talk about the pull, and the visual I had in mind is it's nearly like a gravitational pull, where the natural space to be in a sense, if you're a customer, you always want, ideally, an agency, or at least you think you do, right? Which is somebody who will do exactly what you want for you, build the exact thing that you want, right? So if you're an agency, you're already in the place where your customers want you, right? And your product is effectively your time. You're building software, but you're not selling software, you're selling your time. Whereas if you are a product company, you're not selling your time, you're selling software. And that's, like you said, Clementine, where all the leverage is. And so if you succumb to that gravitational pull, you end up, like you said, in a sort of unhappy middle place where you are trying to sell software, you are priced around selling software, but more and more demands are being made on your time that are not around improving the product, but actually about serving your customers with your time. And I think it's really important to stay true to yourself, right? If you sort of succumb to the pull, you don't usually end up all the way on the agency side of things. You end up in a worse third place where, in a sense, you kind of get the worst of both worlds.
You end up in a worse third place. That's the thing. Both of the models on the ends of the spectrum work, and what doesn't work is not knowing who you are or what you're trying to do. And so if you're a product company and you're building a platform, moving towards one-offs is on average going to tank your velocity. It's going to make it really, really hard to crank out your core tools, the main thing that you're trying to do. And it's going to make you slower to innovate on any kind of like chosen direction, right? You're going to be sort of innovating a little bit in response to what the customers are asking for, and there can be some value in that. The other thing I think we've seen when we've succumbed at various moments to these custom requests is it can be really tough for your team, for morale and for retention, because you end up having people on the team who are sort of working on a thing that feels not like the clear stated coherent direction, and that can kind of be poison.
I think that's actually a really interesting point about team. And there's a sort of culture piece here. Tell me if you agree, where people join a company because they are promised something, right? And there's the stuff that's promised contractually, your salary or whatever. But I think, especially for talented folks, the thing that really excites them is the vision. You get sold a particular vision. And again, if you're a product company, you're selling a vision of building a product that is highly scalable, can, in some sense, have a really big impact, really big leverage. And people join because of that. And then you put them, like you said, forward deployed, building custom code that only supports a single customer, and they get frustrated. And not only do they perhaps enjoy the work less, but they feel, in a sense, betrayed, that they've been subject to a bait and switch, right? They were promised one thing on coming in and they've been given something else. And that can really build up a level of resentment within the organization.
This is so, so true. And it's especially true in our case. So we're a nonprofit, which means that people really are coming here for the mission. And so when we, for example, our version of margins is like, how much impact does this thing have? How many people does it move out of prison? Or our version of revenue is impact. So it's like counting the number of people that this particular tool moves off of parole. And so people are coming for that. And they are coming for the promise of working on this problem that is at a massive scale, right? You have millions and millions of people caught in this apparatus that's not producing very good outcomes, and the states don't like it, and the people on our team don't like it, and certainly the people in the system don't like it. And that's the mission they're coming for. And so if their experience is that they are building tools that are scaling, that are starting to attack that problem, and they can see the progress, that is one version of the job. And a very different version of the job is they've sort of lost the thread, right? Like you're building one-off stuff for a single customer that you don't understand who else needs. And yeah, exactly as you said, that can just be really, really hard for morale.
It's a real trust breaker, I think, is the thing. And so it's worth
Mhm.
considering. One of the things that people might be thinking is, what's so bad about doing these one-offs? Imagine you have a big customer, they're going to buy your software, but they're also say, hey, we want these customizations and we're happy to pay for that. They're not asking for it for free. They're saying, we're going to pay you a good hourly rate or a project fee for doing this customization. And as a founder, especially, you see those dollars and you're struggling to just keep the lights on. It's incredibly appealing. So why is this so challenging? Why are we warning against something that to many folks might seem like a bit of a gift?
I mean, I think that this is definitely one of the unspoken rules that's never explained. And the way that I see it is, again, it's about knowing what kind of company you're trying to build. If you're a product company, you are building software, and software is really expensive to build, to maintain, to keep competitive, right? Like the real double-edged sword of building software is that anyone can come along at any time and copy your product and add new features, and now they're out ahead of you. And so if you are investing in an engineering team, but not spending that engineering team's time innovating, you are getting behind essentially. And so it comes back to this idea that you need to know which of these two things you are and not try to sit in the middle. Either you are a consultancy and you will take happily a high hourly rate for your time to build something custom, or you are a product company and the thing that you build needs to scale. And in our case, it needs to have a margin of impact that makes sense. Otherwise, you're putting the most expensive thing, which is your engineering resources, on something that won't scale. And you're slowly losing the thread of who you're trying to be and what you're trying to get done.
I'm going to be the devil's advocate here. I can hear people saying, what if the extra revenue allows us to hire another engineer? So it's fully funded. It's not an unfunded thing. This company or this customer says, hey, I want this thing, and I'm going to pay you $200,000. That will cover an engineer for a year. So you're saying, Clem, oh, well, we're using our most valuable resource on this thing. And as a founder, I would counter by saying, well, but we're being paid for that. We can hire that resource. So
Yeah.
there are always exceptions to every rule. But why is that not a complete reason to say yes and to go ahead anyway?
I mean, I think that that's what system integrators are for, right? So your platform should have a purpose and should scale if you are a product company. But there may well be many, many cases where you have customers who you want to support. And in that case, I think that's why you see companies like Google and Microsoft build out reseller ecosystems, build out system integrator ecosystems, so that their big flagship enterprise customers can get the things that they need without you sort of deviating from your core roadmap. And I think startups can do this. Obviously, Google and Microsoft can do this. And you might say, like, those are not good examples. But I think if you're a 10 or a 40 or an 80-person team, it's still completely possible for you to get a request from a customer and say, this is a reasonable thing. They are willing to pay for it. It is not on our roadmap. Therefore, we can't build it. But what we can do is go subcontract it out to a person who we think would be really good at building these Power BI bolt-ons to our tools, or Twilio integrations with our tools, or whatever it is that that customer needs, right? Even as a startup, even very, very early on, you can start to think about what that system integrator or reseller ecosystem looks like for your tools. And that will allow you to avoid that kind of death spiral where you're caught in between these two places, which, as we talked about, has all of these bad effects, right? Your pricing model, your maintenance model, your actual org structure, the morale of your team are all going to get caught in that morass. But you can still, find ways to make those things happen through like a system integrator ecosystem, I think.
So what you've said is quite subtle there, so I think it's worth diving into a little bit more. You're talking about effectively making your product into a type of platform by basically saying, okay, if you want this stuff customized, you can have it customized by someone else, and we will give that someone else, which you are calling the systems integrator, we're going to give them the tools and the access that they need to our product in order to do it, right? So at that point, you need to build the affordances, whether it's, APIs or complex admin settings and so on, that allows those customizations to be made.
Yeah, that's right. Or if you're still a 12-person team and that all seems hard, you can even do things that are as simple as bringing on a contractor or a subcontractor so that at least you maintain your team's focus, right? At least having that clean split where your team can keep on their proactive roadmap and not get distracted and say, we're going to have this other team, however small it is, do this other thing. That's exactly what I'm saying. And if you think about it, like, this is how big tech companies approach this, right? And I think maybe taking a step back, there's sort of two things that happen with a custom request. You get a custom request, and the first question is this on the roadmap anywhere? One answer is no. This is a thing we never want to build. We don't know that for sure, but it's nowhere on our horizon. A very different version is like, this is a thing that's pulling us into the future. We're not ready for this yet, but we want to get there. I think you treat those two kinds of requests actually pretty differently, right? So I'm talking here about the world where, like, you're pretty sure that this is never going to be part of your core value prop. You believe that this is a thing that, for example, doesn't scale. You see why it's useful to this person, but you don't really see it scaling to your other customers. In that case, that's where you might want to build the system integrator approach. There's a whole different class, I think, of custom use cases. And I think this distinction really matters for those of us who are working in enterprise. And this other class is the one where, like, they're right. And the request is kind of pulling you into the future on some level. Like, when you've got 50 customers like we do, half the time when they're requesting something we don't have or think we don't want to build, half the time it's somewhere out there on the roadmap. It's 3 months out, it's 6 months out, it's 18 months out. Those I think you handle a little differently, right? Those are cases where, like, actually the margin, as it were, might matter. So in our case, we might say, well, we didn't want to do this thing for 12 months. We don't feel totally ready to do this thing, but the impact would be so high that it makes sense. And so in the for-profit case, that might be that the revenue makes the deal make sense because you can invest in the resources now to pull your roadmap forward. I think that's kind of a different situation than the request that's actually pulling you meaningfully away from what scale looks like for your company.
That makes a lot of sense to me. And I think the lens I might view it through is prioritization, right? So I think at any point in time, you have a bunch of things that you would like to do. And then if you are managing your roadmap well, if you're managing your product well, then you're going to have some sort of prioritization where you say, this is what we do first, and then we do this second and third and so on. And that can, in some sense, come and be a roadmap. The difference with these true one-offs is that they are nowhere on your priority list. There is no place for them there. This is not a feature that you would like to have as part of your product, and therefore you don't really want to ever get it in your roadmap. Whereas I think what happens in the other case is, let's say we've got a feature that is number 6 on your priority list and you'll get to it in 12 months. And if a big customer says, this is what I really want, you can, in a sense, incorporate that into your prioritization heuristic and say, because this customer really wants this, it justifies moving it higher on the roadmap. So it doesn't break your actual existing system. You're still prioritizing things based on various signals, market signals, your own product sense, technical architecture, and so on. And you've got new information, which is a big customer really wants this thing. And so, of course, that should affect your prioritization. It doesn't feel unnatural.
I think that's exactly right. That almost puts it into a bucket that feels less like custom and more like signal, market signal. So if you think about it, like when you are a brand new company and you are working on your first customer, it is all by definition custom. You only have one customer. And so either the fewer customers you have, or the more important you think this customer is to your particular signal, the more canonical you think they are, the more you think that, for example, them building on your platform is going to make you better, the more you sort of value their usage for whatever reason that is. So like, just to get out of the abstract a little bit and use some examples from our world, we have states that are on our platform that are incredibly innovative and charismatic. And so their feature requests, we're going to prioritize more and differently because they drive the platform forward. We sort of like believe their requests in a fairly deep way. We feel like they understand what they need, which is like a hard thing for enterprise customers often, right? Because you're battling like a large group with thousands and thousands of people. And so their own ability to diagnose what they need can often be quite poor through no fault of any individual person's. But that's like a thing you have to watch out for with enterprise customers. And so just as you say, like, in some cases, you want to have a distinction between like, is this a total one-off that has nothing to do with anything on our roadmap? Or is this actually signal from the market? Is this like a signal we want to pay attention to and think about iterating in that direction? And that's sort of like customer-driven innovation, which has to be a core part of building toward the future if you're an enterprise company. You're not the one sitting there making up all of the features. It's being defined by the way it's being used and what people want next. But there are going to like inherently be customers that you think get it more, that you think are more canonical, that you think are asking for stuff that's going to scale. And I think you want to pay attention to all of those signals. So none of this is to say that you like never build things that feel custom in the sense that a customer is asking for them. Here's what I think is sinister. What's sinister is the ones that are not on your roadmap and come with an ongoing maintenance burden. That's what I think is real death. Because here's another thing that I think you can even get away with, right? Obviously, as we're talking about, like, you can absolutely do great work with customer-driven innovation. That's like a category. There's another category where you can do medium great work, which is this is a thing we don't really want to build, but it's super important to them. We think the impact will be really high or the margin will be really high. And there's no maintenance burden. It's somehow a point in time. So like we've had instances where states had some really bad laws coming down the pipeline that were going to do some serious damage if they passed, and the state requested help defending against those laws. It's not really what we do, but our customers were asking for it, and it had a huge potential impact, and it was a point in time. Where I think things can go real awry is when you do something that's off your roadmap, not inherently what you do, but then the ongoing maintenance burden is forever. I think that's where we get into all of the like morale challenges and diffusion of focus and confusion on the team's core mission that we talked about before. And those things are really hard to navigate through, I think.
I'd love to explore with you if there are more examples that, again, Recidiviz being in a slightly unusual business, you talk about a law and building a one-off. I would kind of challenge in the sense that I would say most requests for custom work are not moments in time. Maybe I'm lacking imagination here, so you can help me out. But I'm like, when people ask for things, especially when you're building a software product, whatever software you build, unless it's throwaway, and when would it be throwaway, requires maintenance. So while I agree with you, like theoretically what you're saying is correct, how often is it the case that you have this sort of moment in time work that you can then move on from cleanly?
Well, it's funny, and maybe this is specific to our business, or maybe it's something that others can generalize and steal. But one thing that we often try to do when we get a one off request for a tool from an agency, in our case, an agency means like a state government agency. So often when we get a one off request for a tool, we will try to steer it towards a data analysis. Because a data analysis is a thing that can, for example, answer a really important question about what direction they need to head or what is happening in their system, what's driving prison admissions, what's driving racial disparities, which education programs are working. And they may think that they want a tool for that. And maybe they do. And maybe a tool would be the ideal thing. But often we can give them a point in time analysis that has no maintenance burden, that costs us some data analysis work, but stays fixed in that point in time. And so you might also explore whether in your model there are things like that, where you can say, okay, what the customer is asking for is to get a certain piece of information every day as a notification at the top of their inbox. What if we can't do that, but we can give them the answer once a year? Like, is there any value in doing that? And I think what we found is they almost always would like to have the information once a day, but sometimes we can provide a lot of value by telling them once a year.
Okay, that's actually really helpful and tactical. So maybe, again, trying to frame what you're saying here. I think my position that software nearly always requires maintenance and is rarely thrown away is probably true. So what you're actually saying here is be creative. If they are asking for custom software, can you give them something instead that's not software? Because
Yeah.
often those things will not require maintenance. And I think that's actually a really clever way of looking at it. I think the default should always be if you're asked for software, that's going to have a long tail of cost for you. But again, just because a customer is asking for that, put your product manager hat on and try to understand what problem it is they have. And if there's a way to solve that problem to their satisfaction in a way that doesn't leave you with this maintenance hangover.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think on some level, we should all be building software as a last resort, right? Like,
Indeed.
software is expensive and doesn't make sense unless it scales. And so, if you have any lack of certainty that this request is going to come again from other customers, many points in time, in a sustainable way, that the revenue will come through, if you have any questions about any of those things, you're going to want to try something first before software. And this is why we build napkin sketches and we build mocks and we build all kinds of things before we build software, because on some fundamental level, you should build software as a very last resort.
Yeah, that's really valuable. And, this quote from one of the granddaddies of 20th century software engineering, I think it was Edgar Dijkstra, who used to train his students to say, when there's a new feature, how many lines of code does it cost, right? The idea that every line of code you write is something that you then are paying for over and over again, which is, by the way, why measuring the productivity of your engineers by lines of code written is so dysfunctional and missing the point entirely, right? The best engineers write as little code as they can get away with. So, yeah, I think that is a broader principle, absolutely. But it is doubly the case. I think that's maybe the focus here that I feel I've learned something is, okay, you should always be minimizing the amount of software you build, but when it's custom, all the more so, because the one thing you get from software, as you say, is leverage, is that infinite scalability at incredibly high margins. And if you're building it for only one customer, the one thing that software is really good at, you're neutralizing. So it's the worst option.
Yeah.
And if there's anything else you can do other than write software, that is the thing you should be doing.
Yeah, this feels incredibly unprofound for 20 minutes into the conversation, but like, don't build software that's custom. Try to do everything before building custom software, like do a data analysis. The other thing that you can do, right? Because often, and I think this is the like unspoken tension that's useful to just call out here, when you have enterprise customers, they're more important than you are. They just are, and they will be for a long, long time. And you won't want to say no to very many of them. In our case, because like, we want to solve this problem in all 50 states. And so you're very rarely in a position to or wanting to directly say no. But like I mentioned before, enterprise customers have real challenges knowing what the heck they want. They're structural challenges, right? Thousands of people, tens of thousands of people trying to somehow articulate their requirements. And so what we've often found to be the best version of no is not a no at all, but to say, oh, it's so interesting that you want that. Tell us everything about why. And we mean like everything. Like, we're going to come for 3 days and visit you and just keep asking you questions about why you want this thing. And we're going to follow you around and you're going to tell us every time that you would possibly use that thing. And like, by the end of those 3 days, one of two things have happened. Either we have discovered that we were wrong, that there should have been something on our roadmap that wasn't on our roadmap, that they were so right and that there was something incredibly valuable that we should have been building either now or later. But that's the rarer case. The more common case is that like we've done this work in 15 states now. A lot of the problems start to look similar. And so we're able to usually guide that request somewhere onto the roadmap. Often they'll add a small feature or something new, but like the inherent problem looks kind of the same shape as other problems we've seen before. And so there's no anywhere in that process, but there's a like continuing to understand and then figuring out like, were we missing something or were they?
I mean, you sell yourself short by saying it doesn't seem that profound. I think it's simple, but it's actually the intersection of two things here. Oh, look, maybe I'm just not very bright and it seems profound to me and not to anybody else. But I think the intersection of the two things is where the profundity lies, which is software is very expensive and it is a way of gaining leverage. That is its one benefit, is being able to reproduce it infinitely. One-off work in software neutralizes that. So if you get at that intersection of somebody wants you to build one-off software and you're a product company, you're not selling your time, you're selling software, it is nearly always a poor return on that investment. And therefore, you should do something
Yes.
else. And then
Yes.
the second piece of what you're saying is, what that means is you need to take your product discovery into overdrive, right? You need to turn into a weird, creepy stalker, is sort of how it sounded.
Yeah. Exactly.
And
That's right. Like if you're building software that doesn't scale, begin again. That's not the way. You can build all kinds of fabulous things that don't scale. You can draw things on paper. You can do data analysis. You can make presentations. You can have graphic design. But if you are building software that doesn't scale, you're in a pretty bad place. And like, look, we all end up there. Heaven knows we've ended up there many times, but it's a place you want to try to exit as quickly as possible because, as you said, it just neutralizes the only good thing about software. If you're building software that doesn't scale, you're just like a tech bro with none of the upside, you know?
you'll remember when we were back at Google, one of the kind of dirty secrets of all the big tech companies is the number of contractors they employ to do manual work, manual data entry of various sorts, manual data cleaning of various sorts. All of these companies, Google, Amazon, Meta, they have tens of thousands of people generally in lower cost of labor places doing this stuff. And I think software makes sense above a certain level, but in a one-off, quite often if it's like, oh, we need this data integration or so on, consider using people for that. Software seems lovely and shiny, but often it's going to be cheaper just to have someone doing the data entry for you than building that integration.
Behind and around and in front of and surrounding all of the fanciest, most beautiful UIs you've ever used are like a bunch of people doing stuff that it didn't make sense to build software to do. Like you and I used to work on Google Maps. There was a whole team that gathered data about the world. The number of humans that worked on non-software things on Google Maps in order to produce like one beautiful app at the end, non-software things, was huge. So yes, I think there's almost always a cloud of non-software things going on. And I think a lot of that is hidden and that is confusing to people.
My favorite story from Google Maps is from my early days of joining it. The satellite imagery comes from satellites and also from planes and so on doing this aerial photography. And the colors are all over the place, right? There are clouds, there's different conditions in the sun and so on. And so there needs to be a whole lot of color correction that happens to all of this imagery so that it looks nice and smooth across different flights and so on. And we literally had a team of, I think it was over 1,000 people in India whose job was to basically do coloring in on these maps and make sure all the water was the same shade of blue and all the forests were the same shade of green. And, yes, eventually that got automated. But for a long time, this beautiful, magical piece of software had 1,000 people just doing coloring in. And I always found that hilarious.
Yeah. Software is a last resort. Even the biggest tech companies know that software is a last resort.
This episode of the Startup Podcast is brought to you by Vanta. The team at Vanta are passionate about helping you secure your business by vastly cutting down on the time to get compliant with frameworks like ISO 27001, SOC 2, and Essential 8. Vanta lets you close deals, sleep better at night, and get back to building your product. Help yourself and help the podcast by going to vanta.com/TSP for an exclusive 20% off deal. Let's talk about qualifying leads. Maybe it's less relevant for Recidiviz because you've only got 50 leads and you kind of want them all. But for most businesses serving enterprises, there are many, many potential customers. And it's tempting to say yes to all of them, but perhaps you shouldn't. How do you think of that?
So I think there's sort of two times when it makes some sense to say yes. One is when the margin is super, super high. And so it's going to drive innovation across the rest of your business. And I think that can be compounded, that can lead you closer to a yes if the maintenance burden is relatively low. Again, in our case, margin looks like the impact is just like too good to pass up, or maybe the revenue is too good to pass up. And specifically, the revenue is not only going to like sustain this deal, it's going to be the tide that rises all boats. And then I think there's some kickers that you can add on top of that. So for us, it would be like the impact is going to be incredibly high and the maintenance burden is really, really low. And we think it might exist somewhere on our roadmap at 18 months out. That's like one case where I could see you saying yes. And if any of those three things are true in isolation, so the margin is super high, but the other two things don't square, I think that's where you want to start to build processes on your teams that let you evaluate along these different criteria. So I think one of the best things you can do as soon as you recognize that you are an enterprise company that is prone to these forces is you want to set up a meeting between your sales and your product team. Because sales is going to hear it first and product is going to want to say no. And that's them doing their job. Sales will want to say yes, product will want to say no.
Yeah.
And so I think one of the healthiest things that you can do is define some of these criteria, like what margin will make us look twice. So for us, what kind of level of impact is going to make us look twice? What maintenance burden are we never going to sign up for? And then like, what does our roadmap look like? And start to figure out what these criteria look like and have a set place. So for us, we have this meeting called Go, No Go, where like our sales team can come, they can say X state wants this. Our products team can come. They can duel right out in the open. They can talk about cases where we signed up for something and it turned out to be a mistake. Other cases where we did it and it wasn't a mistake. But you can go through the decision. You can document the decision. And whatever happens, you decided and you moved forward. And I think that's important too for all of us running small companies. Like, find processes that you can use that are lightweight, that cause decisions to be made and not unmade. And I think that has to apply here because everyone hates one-offs, right? But sometimes you're going to do them. And when you do them, you got to have a process by which you commit. And then you can have a process later where you retro and you learn and you add that to the never do again list. But like early on, when you feel yourself being pulled into these forces, I think creating that process, whatever it looks like for you, and I think it's often just a simple meeting between sales and product with some good documentation behind it and like a running list of learnings. I would set that up early on and that'll help with a lot of this.
A question that comes to mind, because you rightly point out, sales is incentivized to say yes, product is in a sense incentivized to say no. Ultimately, you need to make a decision. How do you mediate between those two forces, especially I think early on when sales and product are actually both the founder or the founding team, right? Like, how do you make sure you get that balance right between two opposing forces to make a decision that may not always satisfy either or both of them, but is right for the organization and the business?
That's a very, very hard question. Some of it is that it helps to know, are you pre or post product market fit? I tend to think that pre-product market fit is going to favor the sales side a little more and post-product market fit is going to favor the product side a little more. I think that is not a hard and fast rule, but generally sensible, right? Because pre-product market fit, on balance, you have a lot more to learn from your customers. You might be wrong a lot more often. You haven't yet found the thing that for sure works. And so you kind of white knuckling the steering wheel and saying like the platform is going in this direction and we know that this is going to work when you're pre-product market fit, I think makes a lot less sense. When you're post, if you're continuing to be sales led, post product market fit, then we get back to the place where we're like, guys, what are we doing? You know, we're building software that doesn't scale. So I think that's one way to try to mediate it. And I think inherent in that is the idea that you will probably not come down on the same side of this equation in every quarter. You need to be able to have a way of documenting the decision you're making, doing a retro on how it went, and then coming back every 6 months and saying, do we want to land at a different place on this? Do we want to put the balance point somewhere else? Are we being too sales led right now? Are we being too product led right now? Are the number of one-offs that we've brought on tanking velocity? Are they hurting retention? Like, this is your job as a leader, is to try to figure out where that balance point is and to also not like set and forget it and think that it's going to somehow stay in exactly the same place forever.
This is where the pragmatism comes in. I think there's a part of me that feels sometimes a bit of a fundamentalist on this stuff where I'm like, well, you shouldn't allow your roadmap to be dictated by your customers. You shouldn't be doing one-offs, right? You're a product company. You should be building the product. You can listen to your customers, but you should be making all of your own decisions. But I think as I've gone through spending more time in tech and in startups, all of my strongly held principles are adapting to become a bit more pragmatic, where it's important to hold the principle, but also to allow some flex in there. And I think that's what you're talking about here is how do you cleave to the principle without being rigid?
There's this ideal that we all hold, which is that we shouldn't build anything that doesn't scale. We shouldn't do any one-offs. And then there's this other ideal, which is that we want to get all 50 states or all of the customers and meet their needs. And one of the best tools we have for this is this document called Pitch No Pitch. And this document has 3 sections, and only the middle one is interesting. And it sort of gets at what you're talking about. So the first section is, this is what we want you to pitch. So this is a document made by our product team for the sales team. Because again, those are the 2 teams of interest in this debate, right? Okay, so the product team makes this document. First section is called Pitch. This is what we want you to pitch, sales team. Bottom is no pitch. You may not pitch this. Why? Because we tried this once and there was only pain. Right? Like these are like proven, tried and true mistakes. They're not theoretical mistakes. These are like things we know cause sorrow.
We have scars.
The middle section is actually where all of the pragmatism comes in. The middle section is where all of the debate happens. The middle section is like, these are things that we built once. They're kind of deprecated. They're a little bit in maintenance mode. We're trying to ramp them down. But like, if they are so powerful and so attractive to one of our states, like tell us. And that's where like the feedback loop between sales and product happens. And so the thing you don't want to lose in all of this by being a fundamentalist is the actual relationship between your product and sales teams. Like the thing that you risk if one is so much more powerful than the other, product always wins or sales always wins, is like you don't actually have a meaningful feedback loop happening that's driving innovation. And so this pitch no pitch doc has been really good because again, you can come back in and update your priors. You can say every 6 months, we're going to go in and actually something that was in that middle zone, we're going to now allow that to be happily pitched. It's now out of medium and into golden pitching territory.
Sorry, you've left the most interesting bit out here, which is the top boring section is called pitch. The bottom boring section is called no pitch. The middle boring section, what do you actually call that?
It's called pitch as last resort.
Okay. Now this is interesting. Right. So what you're saying, let me play it back to you and make sure I understand. The idea is, here are the things that we really want to sell to people. This is core part of our product roadmap. This is our core value prop. We want to put it out there forcefully. Then there's the stuff that is like no go. And then there are these other things where it's really about, let's listen really deeply to the customers. And here are some things we can pull out if we need to, but we'd rather not. But also, if we do pull them out, that's a pretty powerful signal. Maybe this feature is more important than we thought it was.
Exactly. Yeah. So that could be something that's just a little too far out on your roadmap to be comfortable. We don't quite know what we're doing with this thing yet. It could be something you used to do, but you're thinking like, maybe we don't need to do that anymore. But I guess if people keep asking for it, that's really good to know. It's things that are in that category where it's either the future or the past, and you're trying to understand whether they have a role on your platform to play. And that's where like all of the power in the relationship between product and sales happen. Because like everything else is decided. The mistakes that we have scars about, that's decided. But like the pitch as last resort, that's the interesting section.
Yeah, no, I really love that. John Cutler, who I'm a big fan of, and we actually had on the pod a couple of months ago, I think he calls these enabling constraints. He's a big fan of that, right? Which is to say, there are so many decisions that need to be made. There are certain times when constraints are actually there to help you make decisions more easily. And I think what you've got here is a really great articulation of the enabling constraints to make product and sales work better together, to make a pitch more effective, right? Which is saying, these are things you should definitely be selling. These are things you should definitely not be selling. And so you've kind of placed those enabling constraints over all the kind of no-brainer stuff. Now we don't have to think about this stuff. And it allows all the attention to focus in on this narrower area in the middle where the enabling constraints don't apply and where the intelligence and the debate and the wisdom actually come in.
Yes. And as you grow, it also empowers your team, right? It allows you to scale your team because you as leadership aren't thinking about any of the calls in the first and third buckets. Your team is making those calls. But if you've got something that's going forward in the pitch as last resort bucket, your sales and your product team, they come to a go, no go meeting and they go through all of the questions that you've set up to happen in that meeting. How broad is the demand? How many states have asked for this? How far out is it on our core roadmap? What is the actual upside here? What kind of impact would it have? In those cases where we're doing something that we would call like a little off our critical path, we also have higher level reviewers, right? Our CTO gets looped into those, our head of security gets looped into those. And so I think what's also neat about it is that middle section is where you're driving the discussion. And just as you say, it accelerates every other decision. All of the things in the first and third bucket, those can just go and the team can take care of those. And so it also, as the team grows over time, it allows you to figure out where to focus your decision-making attention, basically, and where you can empower the team to just move forward.
I love that. I think that's one really concrete takeaway that I'd love everyone listening to jot this down. I think this pitch, no pitch document is a really valuable thing and something that you can work together between your product and sales teams on. There's another couple of things in the pre-discussion of the notes that you sent through that I thought were interesting. One is you called the Recidicambrian explosion, and that's too good a phrase to not ask you what that means and how that fits into this sort of pragmatic back and forth. So tell us about the Recidicambrian explosion.
So when we were just starting out, we were maybe 5 people when the COVID pandemic hit. And we were building one tool in one state, the great state of North Dakota. And it was
Everyone's favorite state.
everyone's favorite state. Our future was clear, Yaniv. We knew exactly what we were here to do. We had a vision for the entire space. We knew what the data infrastructure needed to look like. We knew the tools on top of it. We were dialed. We were going. And then the pandemic hit. And we got together as co-founders, and our CTO said, we're going to use this time to hunker down on our roadmap and go. And me and the COO said, we're going to use this time to completely throw our roadmap to the wind. And we sat down over a weekend and we built a model that basically did a completely different thing that had nothing to do with our roadmap. The model showed people what would happen if COVID got into prisons, right? It showed people like how many people would get sick, how many would get hospitalized, and how many would die. And we ended up releasing this model on a Monday, and by like Wednesday, all 50 states had downloaded it. And this sent the company into pandemonium. We went from working with one state to working with 36 overnight. And this ushered in what we now call the Recidicambrian explosion, because we were a tiny team growing just like hand over fist every single day. We were hiring new people. We were working with a tremendous number of states. The phones were ringing off the hook, and we ended up just like building stuff. It was a Cambrian explosion. When we finally settled down and looked back at the destruction in our wake, we had like 17 tools being used by 21 states. So it was all custom. So when I give you advice on avoiding custom, it's nothing that we did correctly. It's all things that we've learned from doing it wrong. And then we started this period of reining it back in. And, I think there's this other thing, maybe you'll disagree with this as the more fundamentalist of the two of us, but I think it's also healthy for companies to go through a bit of an ebb and flow where there are moments, there are quarters where you have a little bit of more flex capacity for innovation. You're actually willing to be a little bit more customer led, and you're willing to listen a little bit more and use that to drive some customer led innovation. And there are certainly other quarters, and sometimes it's many, many quarters in a row where you need to pay down tech debt and you need to consolidate and you need to rein it back in. And so, it took us a good 18 months of cleanup after the Recidicambrian explosion to migrate our way back to 3 tools from 17, but we got there.
Well, I mean, you mentioned a few minutes ago that the calculus is different when you are pre-product market fit versus post-product market fit. So I think when you talked about the Recidicambrian explosion, it nearly feels like, well, if we're pre-product market fit and we try a bunch of stuff, and some of the stuff that we try is led by customers, then that's okay because it is part of our exploration phase, right? I think one way of thinking of like pre versus post PMF is that exploration versus exploitation kind of model. Early on, you need to figure out what works. And once you figure out what works, then you need to start exploiting that, meaning actually doubling down and investing in that thing. And so I'm sure this was deliberate, but I think that the Cambrian explosion analogy is apt, right? Because I think that's the thing with evolution. I'm not like a paleontologist, but my understanding is that you do have, I think it's called punctuated equilibrium, right? Which is you have a whole lot of new species coming online. And the Cambrian explosion was one of those times. Like change in environmental conditions leads to huge numbers of new species, right? And effectively, they're trying to find PMF in these new environmental conditions. And then over time, most of them go extinct. And the ones that really nailed it, they multiply across the earth. And that's really, I love that analogy. I think it makes a lot of sense that you're saying, okay, there are times of being more expansive and more exploratory. And then there are times of consolidation and letting evolution do its thing, which is mostly like killing things off and driving extinction. So,
yeah, that's exactly right. And I think part of your job as a leader is to figure out when you need to declare a new geological era, as it were, and say, okay, we've found a model that's really good. and this works, and we're going to consolidate way down and put a lot more wood behind this arrow.
Staying on that theme, at my last startup, we actually did a lot of our planning in terms of what we called epochs, which is exactly that. We found quarters or years too constraining because we didn't know how long things would take, but it was an era for the company, an epoch around which we made plans. And at the end of that epoch, we needed to revisit everything.
Exactly.
One of the other challenges of working with enterprises as a startup, I've found, is a mismatch in pace. Right. So when you're a startup, you're very twitchy, you're trying to do stuff really quickly, run experiments, build the thing today, deploy it tomorrow, whatever it is. And then you work with an organization that has a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of approval steps, a lot of stakeholders. And that impedance mismatch can be really challenging. And obviously, you've managed to be very successful at Recidiviz, driving change and working alongside what must be some extremely slow-moving bureaucracies. So what are some of your tactical tips for managing that type of mismatch and really collaborating effectively and making progress as rapidly as is feasible in the circumstances?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. I mean, I'll say something at the high level and then some tactical things. I think at the high level, the best thing that you can do as a scrappy startup working with huge enterprises or with the government is leverage your strengths. Like they want and need your energy. And there are all kinds of things that you can do that are so hard for them to do. So in our case, when we can go to the head of an agency and we can say, hey, we'll come fly there, we'll spend time with your line level staff, people you don't have time to get out in the field and listen to. We'll conduct a listening tour, we'll synthesize all of these learnings, and we'll figure out a roadmap that makes sense for you. We will look at your policies, we'll look at your data, we'll understand the problems you're up against, and we'll connect it to everything your staff are saying. You're basically using your energy to your advantage because you're giving them something that they don't have, which I suppose seems simple, but I think the approach we often take instead is waiting on them in some way. And so if you can find ways to not wait and to instead say, we have these really valuable skills and tools and energy and pace that they need, and just offer those things to them, that has been really, really powerful.
So is there an element of finding champions? Because I think in a bureaucracy, there are people who want what you have to offer, right? That ability to move faster than that organization and give them something they need. And there are other people who I guess are protective of the way of doing things. So, I mean, I'm curious in your thoughts. You're a lot more experienced than me around, is there an element of navigating those internal politics where you have any really sort of concrete insights?
100%. Yeah, you can get nowhere without a really clear identified champion in the enterprise world. And maybe we should do a whole separate episode on how you find your champion and strengthen them. And usually these systems tend to be places where everyone has to say yes. And if one person says no, you're toasted. So your champion and empowering them is like so critical. And you need to so deeply understand what that champion really, really, really needs, and so deeply empathize with why the person who doesn't want you to exist doesn't want you to exist. You have to like really understand that and spend time with that person too. And so I think a lot of the tactics actually come down to doing things that tech companies are often not very good at. We often like to think about the products we're building and building software. And often what you need to do to get enterprise right in the beginning is like fly to North Dakota and drive around with parole officers. So a lot of it is very in-person based, right? Going and spending a ton of time with your very first champion to understand what you can do to make their life easier. I think there's also this very important tactic with enterprise customers is the idea that it's way more important to have like 3 customers who love what you do than it is to have like 100 that think it's pretty good or think it's really good. And so I think the degree of champion that you need is proportional to the size and inertia of the bureaucracy. If they need to move a really large system, they need to be way, way, way more fired up. One other thing that we've just found to be super useful, and this may apply to others, is like get them together in a room. If you've got enterprise customers that are often having to spend their days moving a really big oil tanker, the chances are that they don't find that fun. And the chances are that they would actually like to get together, commiserate with their peers, and imagine how the world could be different. Like, the chances are they didn't get into their job to steer a really hard to move ship. They probably got in there to try to change things, and they probably have a vision. And so if you can get them together with their peers, they can often unleash each other, and then you can learn a lot about what you need to build to help them.
Yeah, I think that's really great advice. Well, that's a perfect place to wrap up. Clementine Jacoby, thanks so much for being generous with your time, for everything you've achieved, and for sharing your wisdom with the Startup Podcast audience. If folks would like to follow you or learn more about what you do online, where's the best place for them to find you?
Yeah, so we are on LinkedIn, we are on Twitter. Both of those are just at Recidiviz. And then you can also find our website at recidiviz.org.
Right, and Recidiviz is spelt Recidiviz, or Z for our North American listeners. Folks, if you are regular listeners of the Startup Podcast, you know that you have signed up implicitly to the Startup Podcast Pact. And that means in return for all the great value that we give you, we trust you to honor your side of things, which is to follow, rate, and review us in your listening app, and give us a shout out on LinkedIn or wherever it is that you have your audience. Now, Clementine, you know all of the biggest jailers in the United States, so I'm sure folks who are not honoring the pact, you can help me round them up.
Thanks, Yaniv.
Thanks so much. Appreciate your time. This episode of the Startup Podcast was brought to you by Vanta. Vanta helps businesses get and stay compliant by automating up to 90% of the work for the most in-demand compliance frameworks. With over 200 integrations, you can easily monitor and secure the tools your business relies on. Head to vanta.com/TSP for 20% off their incredible offering and start unlocking extra revenue today.